Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time. This is Masechet Bava Batra, and this is our second class where we are going to be reviewing Daf 9 through 15. We were in the middle of speaking about charity and tzedakah, and we're going to continue talking about that. Daf 9 tells us a story of people who violated communal edicts, and the community punished them, the communal leaders punished them for violating these communal rules. The Gemara continues and tells us that you should not make charity collectors account for any of their money spent. As we mentioned last week, the people that are in charge of collecting the charity are very trustworthy, and therefore we trust them to spend the money appropriately. So too with the treasurer of the temple of the Beit HaMikdash. These are people that we trust, and therefore they don't necessarily have to show accountability. They say that we should investigate a poor person's needs if the poor person says that they need food, but you do not investigate if they need clothing, or maybe the opposite. If someone says that they're hungry, we believe them. You don't investigate if they need clothing, so then maybe then you do have to investigate. You must give a traveling poor person a loaf of bread for the road. If he's staying, so you need to give him a bed and a pillow, and 3 meals if the person is staying for Shabbat. So this is like rules of how much tzedakah we need to give, even to people who don't live necessarily in your community. If a person is collecting charity door to door, so then you don't have to give him from the public charity funds, because presumably he has collected enough on his own. Or you should still give from the public funds, because if he's asking for money, he still needs it. Now let's talk about donating to the fund. You have to donate at least 1/3 of a shekel per year to tzedakah. Now that is a very small amount, but the Gemara says that the mitzvah of tzedakah, of charity, is equal to all other mitzvot, and really you should be giving a lot more. Better to get others to give tzedakah as well, right? Not only should you be giving, but you should encourage the people around you to give as well. And if you don't give charity, the Gemara tells us that the government is going to end up coming and taking that money from you anyway. So whether it's a tax or some sort of financial, that there an expense. Basically, the money is going to leave you no matter what. You might as well give it voluntarily. As we've learned previously, they used to give the machatzit shekel, the half a shekel coin, when the Beit HaMikdash, when the temple was standing, and this atoned for the person. Now we have to give regular charity, and again, if not, then the government is going to come and take the money anyway. The Gemara continues and tells us that charity is like armor, right? If you think about armor, it has like links, right? So every link adds up to great armor, right? And I think it's a beautiful image of, you might think, what does it matter if I give 5 shekel here and 5 shekel there, or even a shekel here and a shekel there? But the Gemara paints a picture of you're building your armor, and every piece matters, right? So to every coin of tzedakah adds up. When Rav Sheshet couldn't prove his statements, so Rav Achadroi made fun of him, and then what happened, right? He became mute and he forgot his Torah, right? So here we see some tension between sages, and his mother came and asked Rav Sheshet to daven for the other rabbi, and she basically debased herself in front of him, and that's why Rav Sheshet was referred to as the child that debased the ways of the mother. So just I think an unfortunate story. Okay, let's go back to tzedakah. If you do tzedakah in secret, so then you're greater than Moshe. And we know that Moshe is a great scholar or leader. If you give tzedakah, the Gemara continues, you get 6 different blessings. And if you comfort a poor person, you get 11 blessings, right? And this is based on a verse in Yeshayahu. If you want to give charity, Hashem gives you money in order to give, and it helps you find needy people, right? So it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting perspective, right? Hashem gives you extra money so that you would have money to give charity, right? A lot of people say, oh, I don't have any money to give to charity. And the Gemara is saying, no, the money that you have, Hashem gave you so that you can give it to the poor. Your children will have wisdom and wealth and knowledge if you give tzedakah. So not only does it help you, it helps the next generation as well. Okay, Daf 10 continues and says that the Gemara asks, if God wants to make sure everyone has money, why doesn't God just give everybody money, right? Why does he ask us to give money, right? Ask people to give money to the poor? So the answer is that so that we can give charity and get rewarded and stay out of Gehenom, right? This idea that God is giving us an opportunity for reward. From here, there's an interesting dialogue between Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus. Turnus Rufus was a Roman general, and they used to argue, the two of them, they used to argue a lot. So he says, again, right, the Turnus Rufus says, you shouldn't give charity, right? God should give them money, right? Why do you have to give them money? And he says, no, right? Hashem is like the king, and so Turnus Rufus says it's as if, right? Let's say the Hashem is the king, and he's mad at his son, and then someone, Turnus Rufus says it's like a king who's mad at a person, and then someone comes and feeds them. Don't you think that the king would be mad, right? You're feeding him, and God, the king didn't want you to feed him. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, Hashem, it's as if it's a king who's mad at his son, and he doesn't feed him, but really he doesn't want his son to starve. So when someone feeds him, the king is very happy. And then Turnus Rufus says, wait, really? It's like you're his children, right? Doesn't the verse say that the Jewish people are like servants of God? But it also says you're like the children of God, right? This should remind you of our tefillot on Rosh Hashanah, right? We're like avadim and we're like banim, right? So Rabbi Akiva says, you're right, we're called both. And Turnus Rufus says, maybe it's when you're not doing good deeds, that's when you're servants. But the Gemara says, yes, but you still need to give tzedakah. It doesn't matter if we're avadim, it doesn't matter if we're servants or we're children, we still need to give charity. And we're always both, right? It reminds us of the famous prayer of Avinu Malkeinu, right? We call God our Father, our King, meaning it's both. We have that dual relationship. It's not if you act one way, it's one way, and if you act another way, it's another way. Okay, since we were actually just talking about Rosh Hashanah, but the Gemara tells us that everything for your year is determined on Rosh Hashanah, right? Your gains and your losses. So if that's the case, again, why should someone give charity, right? If money's taken away from you, it's predetermined. So we say, no, it's better to give tzedakah instead of having someone take away your money. Okay, Rav Papa, there's a story of Rav Papa who almost fell from a ladder, and he asked himself, what did I do to deserve, right, this almost death, right? The idea of falling from a ladder in Masachet Sanhedrin, it says that it's instead of getting stoned. So what did I do to deserve this? So the Gemara says, maybe you didn't give enough tzedakah, and if you don't give enough charity, it's as if you did idolatry, and that would cause a punishment of stoning. All charity and good deeds are to bring shalom, peace between us and God. Not only that, but giving charity brings the redemption. Um, and the Gemara tells us that there are 10 hard things in the world, hard as in like strong, right? And each one of them breaks the previous one, right? So God created a mountain, and then he created metal. Metal can break the mountain. Then he created fire. Fire can melt the metal. Right, then water puts out the fire. It's kind of like Chagadia, right? The clouds can absorb the water, right? The wind blows the clouds. Our body, right, kind of gets through the wind or can persevere from wind. Fear can break a body, right, from the inside. Wine can break fear. Sleep can, kind of make it better if you got drunk. And death is, right, trumps all. And we know that there's a line that says, "Tzedakah tatzil mimavet," right? Charity saves us from death. So charity is basically stronger than all of these 10 things. If you give charity, we're going to continue, right? If you give charity, you deserve to see God. So that's why Rabbi Eliezer used to give charity before he would pray, right, before tefillah, and we know that this is actually a custom that people give tzedakah before they daven, and because of this, right, this idea of I'm about to pray, so I want to encounter God, therefore I'm going to give charity. Okay, we said the best way to give tzedakah is to do it anonymously, and also they don't know who gave it to them, right? So you don't know who you're giving it to, and they don't know who gave it to them. If you give tzedakah, it'll give you male children, which is, amazing, and it gives you an eternal reward. Right? Shlomo said that you get the olam haba, a portion in the next world, because of wisdom and not because of wealth, right? And therefore, you should give your wealth away and help others as well. Anyone who was murdered by the Romans, what's called the Harugei Malchut. The Gemara tells us that no one can stand in their place. And I think this, resonated a lot for me right now. All of these soldiers and citizens who were killed, as we say, al kiddush Hashem, while sanctifying the name of God, right? They are on the highest level. If a non-Jew gives charity for ulterior motives, that's seen as sinful. But if they do it for good reasons, so then that is okay. There's a story of Ifra Hormiz. She was the mother of Shvur Malka, who is the king, and she sent money for charity. And at first they didn't want to accept it because she wasn't Jewish. And then Rava finally accepted it. And he said, look, we have to accept it because it brings shalom, it brings peace. And then Rava gave it out to the non-Jewish poor people in the community. Okay, Daf 11, more stories of tzedakah, saving the life of the donor, of the person who gave the money. And then we have Munbaz, the king. He was a Hashmonai king, a Jewish king, and he gave all of his money to feed the poor. Again, it's a machloket whether he was Jewish or not Jewish, but he actually saved lives. We say that tzedakah is the foundation of God's throne, Okay, and that is the end of the discussion of tzedakah. So that was a lot of dapim focused on charity. I think really just beautiful ideas. We should all have the merit to be able to give tzedakah. Okay, before we get to the next Mishnah, the Gemara goes back to the Mishnah from last week that we mentioned. We spoke about if you buy a house in a city, you're called a resident of the city. And now the Gemara says also if you buy a small piece of land, right, a field, you're also seen a resident of the city, or it has to be large enough for there to be a house, in that property. Okay, let's go to the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah, we had spoken about dividing property in, let's say, a courtyard. And we spoke about how you divide it, where you divide it. Now the Gemara is going to talk about the actual division. So the Gemara says we only split a chatzer, a courtyard, if it's 4 by 4, and there's 4 by 4 for every person. And it continues, if you have a field, so then you separate it so that there's 9 kabim for each person, or maybe 9 half kabim for each person. If you have a garden, you split it with half a cup for each, or maybe a quarter. You divide. Oh, okay, so now we have a lot of pictures. So, okay, so here is a picture of an achsadra. Achsadra is an area that is partially, that has like a roof, but it doesn't have walls. If you have this achsadra also, we'll talk about the achsadra in a minute, but also if you have a dovecote, oh no, that's not the picture at the bottom. Sorry, 1 second. If you're dividing a dovecote or a piece of clothing or a bathhouse, each person needs to be able to have enough of that item in order to split it, right? If I have a coat, if you cut the coat in half, I'm not left with I'm left with a shmata, right? So the way the Mishnah says is, if I have, let's say you have a towel, right? And you have a very big towel, and I cut it in half, and everyone has now a hand towel. So then that makes sense to split because everyone gets a towel, right? But as I said, you can't cut a coat in half. That doesn't work. So the Gemara tells us only if after you cut it, it's still called the same thing, a towel, right? As opposed to a coat. As long as it's called the same thing, then you can split it. Now, this could be only if we don't agree, but if they agree, so then you can split it and it doesn't matter what the size is. And we'll discuss this in the Gemara. And if you own holy books, what's called kitvei kodesh, Torah scrolls or other scrolls. Again, in those days, there aren't books, they're scrolls. You cannot divide them if it's too small, even if they both agree, right? So let's say in those days, they would write, let's say, a scroll for Sefer Yehoshua, right, to Joshua. You can't say, oh, I'll take the first half, you get the other half. We say that's not kavod, it's not an honor to the book and to the scroll, and therefore you cannot cut it in half. Okay, now the Gemara tells us, you said you can divide the chatzer, the courtyard, as long as everybody gets 4 by 4. However, the Gemara also teaches us that you get 4 amot in front of your door as well. So you get 4 amot in front of your door, and then you get 4 of the courtyard. So you get really a total of 8. Okay, and then the Gemara tells us that you divide the courtyard either based on the number of doors into the courtyard. So let's say one house has 2, entrances into the courtyard. So then that person might get double the amount of the courtyard. Or the Gemara says, no, each doorway gets 4 amot in front of the doorway. And then the rest of the courtyard gets divided in half. Meaning if you have a house and I have a house, but I have 2 doors and you have 1 door, each door gets 4 amot. And then you take the rest of the courtyard and you divide it in half. What's this idea of giving you well, we'll get to it in a minute. Let's say the doorway is 8 amot wide. So then you get 8 amot opposite the door, but 4 amot deep into the courtyard. Okay, then the Gemara talks about, let's say a person has like this date pit in their in the courtyard. So you get 4 amot around this pit so that you can work. But if there's like an extra, like if there's a doorway there, so then you don't get the extra around it. Okay, now the Gemara tells us, let's say you have this achsadra. Now you can look at the picture on the screen, the top picture. If you have this achsadra, you don't get 4 extra amot in front of your house. Why? What's the point of these 4 amot in front of your house? They're to help you unload your animal, right? Let's say you have a donkey, right? We would call it maybe the garage or your driveway, right? You put in a regular house, you're going to want to put your donkey in front of the door. Then you need space to take everything off the donkey. If you have this achsadra, here it says a portico, so then you can just put your donkey under that roofed area, and then you take off all the things out, off of the donkey. So you don't get an extra 4 beyond that. Let's say you have also this chicken coop you see at the bottom. So the Gemara says you also don't need an extra area in front of the chicken coop. Okay, now the Gemara is going to talk about this scenario of houses that open up into an alleyway. An alleyway is called a mavui, and it's generally numerous courtyards that open up into the alleyway. So let's say a person, okay, let's say, wait, hold on 1 second. Okay, let's say a person from one of the alleyways wants to open up his courtyard into another alleyway on the other side. So the people of the first alleyway can prevent him from doing so. It seems that there was like a tax to the alleyway, to everyone who lives in this alleyway, and they would basically divide it, right? So if the tax was $1,000, you would divide it by the number of entrances into the alleyway. However, if someone wants to open to another side, they would lose out from that person. Right now, you'd have to divide it by 4 instead of dividing by 5, and therefore the people can prevent him from doing that. Okay, if one person of the mavui, of the alleyway, wants to enclose his 4 amot, if you see the red square in front of house number 2, right? Let's say he wants to enclose those 4 amot in front of him. The other people of the alleyway can stop him because he's basically going to make everyone have to walk around. Now, even though he has the right to that area, it's not fair to inconvenience everybody around him. Okay, right, as you can see here, can you see this picture? Hold on 1 second. Okay, can you see, right? Everybody uses the alleyway to get out of their house, right? And everyone in the mavui can have access to the entrance of the mavui, and no one is allowed to limit the access. They can't stop a person from opening up an access that used to exist into, let's say, another mavui, right? If there was an original doorway, so then the person can open up their alleyway. Hold on 1 minute. The Gemara also talks about this case where the last person, right, who nobody's really using that space, maybe he has the right to use this area, right? So we actually have a case like this. I live in a building, and the person who lives like 1 floor down, which is like below the entrance level, like I guess the basement level, so they have the bottom of the stairwell. So what a lot of people do is they say, oh, nobody's using the stairwell down here, I'll make myself a closet, or I'll put all my storage things in the bottom of the stairwell. The same thing here, this person can say, no one uses the back of the alleyway, only I do, so I can use it. However, some people say, well, if the street gets very backed up, people want to maybe throw a party in the alleyway, you're actually blocking this area. So that would be problematic. Okay, Daf 12 speaks about a what happens is you have an alleyway. It's called a mavoi mifulash. Those of you who did Eruvin, so this might remind you. So here you have an alleyway, but the alleyway is open on both sides, and it opens up into another city. So you see like the blue houses and the red houses. Those are two separate cities. So one city is not allowed to close the entrance into the other city, right? They're not allowed to put a wall into that alleyway in order to close the city. Okay, wait, we'll get to this in a minute. Okay, we'll leave it with this. If the public have a route that they're used to taking, you're not allowed to block it up, and you're not allowed to put doors up in an alleyway if they weren't there in the first place. The Gemara tells us that the first 4 amot of an alleyway are considered the public domain. Again, don't forget, you're coming from a main street and you're going into the alleyway. And sometimes if the main street gets very clogged, so then it can overflow into that alleyway. Maybe you can put up a door after the first 4 amot. And the Gemara says, no, even further in, you're not allowed to put in doors into the alleyway. Okay, we talked about dividing a field. So the Gemara says that if you're dividing a field, either it's 9 kabim or 9.5 kabim. And the Gemara says this actually is not a machloket. Rather, it depends on the quality of the land. If the land is very fertile, then even 9 halves would be enough and be equal to 9 full kabim. Okay, and then the question is, what is the size? It's the size it takes for a full day to plow. Maybe in Bavel, but we know that we plow twice. Once during plowing season, and then much less during planting season, right? Plowing season is like the first time, and actually planting season is much easier. It's probably even less than half of the time. Okay, let's say there is a watering hole. So you can divide it as long as everyone is able to water their field for 1 whole day. Let's say you're dividing a vineyard. Everyone should be able to get 3 rows of 12 vines. When the Gemara then kind of goes on a little bit of a segue, that when the temple was destroyed, prophecy, nevuah, moved from the prophets and went to the sages, right? The chachamim, the sages, received prophecy. The Gemara says, wait a minute, sages received prophecy before the temple was destroyed. Rather, the sages continued to have prophecy after the temple was destroyed, but the Nevi'im, the prophets, stopped having prophecy, stopped having nevuah. Since we're talking about sages and Navi, so the Gemara says a chacham, a sage, is better than a prophet, than a Navi, right? And then the Gemara says, well, wait a minute, how can 2 sages say the same thing? That proves that they actually have nivu'ah, right? The idea is it's not that they're prophesizing about the end of days, it's that when they come up with some intellectual idea or philosophical idea, that's divine inspiration. My students always laugh. They don't laugh at me, but I always feel that when I'm in a class, it doesn't matter how much I prepare, but when I'm in a class, like all of a sudden, like things will become much clearer to me. And I'll be like, wow, it's like, not that I have Ruach HaKodesh, that's not what I'm saying, but I definitely feel divinely inspired sometimes. So much so, the sages and the wise people. Okay, the Gemara continues that maybe the opposite, maybe prophecy was taken away from prophets and given it to fools. to a shoteh and to children. And here there's a story of how they appointed Mar Barav Ashi as the head of the yeshiva, and they did so after a fool, a shoteh, actually said that he would be the Rosh Yeshiva. So this was like a proof that that these fools also get prophecy. Another story of prophecy is the story of Rav Chisda with his daughter. This is a very famous story. Rav Chisda asks his young daughter, she was very little, she was actually sitting on his lap, and he says to her, who would you like to marry, Rava or Rami Bar Chama? And they were both his students. And she says, I want to marry both. So interesting that they understood that Rava says at that moment, I want to be the last one, because if there's a second husband, it means something happened to the first husband, and it actually came true, and it shows that she actually had nevuah, right? She's a child, because she ends up marrying Rami Bar Chama, and then he dies, and then she marries Rava. There's actually a book called Rav Chisda's Daughter. It's very interesting. Some people really like it, some people not so much, but it's actually about this daughter and her life. Okay, since we're talking about prophecy, after you eat and you drink, you become more decisive. This is based on a verse. As we know, wine opens up your heart. Okay, let's go back to dividing field. Two brothers get an estate from their father. The firstborn gets double, and the regular son gets one part, right? So basically divided into three. The firstborn gets two, and the other brother gets one. So right, the bechor, the firstborn, gets two fields next to each other. Okay, so now let's say the brother who does yibum, if you remember, let's say there were three brothers. One brother got married, died without any children. Second brother marries the wife. He actually gets a double portion, meaning his portion and the deceased brother's portion. And he gets two fields next to each other, just like the firstborn, or not necessarily, he doesn't necessarily get fields next to each other. Again, you want to have fields next to each other because then it's easier to work those fields. Let's say a son has a field next to his father. When the father dies, he wants the Yerusha, he wants the inheritance of the field next to his. So the other brother should give it to him, or not necessarily, he doesn't have to give it to him. Okay, let's say there were two fields, both have an irrigation canal. So, right, a brother wants the field next to his because sometimes those irrigation canals dry up. So they actually need to split both of those fields. Let's say there was a field with a river on one side and a canal on the other. So that's this picture. So again, if you divide it just in half, it's not fair because everyone wants the water source. And therefore, what you're going to do is you actually divide it like a pizza pie so that every person gets a part of the river, a part of the irrigation canal, and then two parts of the thing that is not, that doesn't have either. Okay, let's say they want to, okay, we're going to get to this in a minute. Okay, let's say they want to split a mansion. If it's not big enough to split, you can force one person to buy out the other, right? This is actually a machloket. Are you allowed to say, there's a certain house, right? Again, half a house doesn't work if it's not big enough. Therefore, you can say either you buy me out or I'm going to buy you out, right? And can you force the other person to do this? Or maybe you can't. And the Gemara gives different scenarios to prove whether or not one can force the other to part with, to buy the other person out, right? So there's a case of a father who left a slave and a non-kosher animal to his children, right? Each one, again, you can't split these things, So maybe, right, the slave serves one brother one day and then works for the other brother the other day. But we're concerned because if one brother frees the slave, then he becomes half a slave, half a free person. But that's really messed up because that person cannot marry anyone because on one hand he's a slave, so he can't marry a Jew, and on the other hand he's free, but he's also a slave, so he can't marry a slave. And therefore you force the other brother to free him. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. And therefore here, this isn't a proof whether you can force the brother to buy the other one out, because it only works for one brother, but not the other brother, because he already set the slave free. Next case, a father left a bathhouse and an olive press to two sons. One brother is rich and one brother is poor. So if they're rented out, so then they just split the profits. But if not, you can't force one brother to buy the other one out because one of them is poor. So obviously he can't do it. So again, we said if something is able to be split and still usable, you can split it. If not, you can make one of the people buy out the other. Or as we said, you can't force them. It's actually a machluket if you can force them or not. Okay. Now, since we were talking about splitting sacred texts, so now we're going to get into a discussion about Torah scrolls or scrolls of books of the Torah. So you cannot cut a Torah scroll in half, but if it's if let's say you own two scrolls, you can split it, right? You get Yeshayahu and I get Yirmiyahu, only if they want, right? And the halacha is that you can force one person to buy out the other, or the Gemara says, no, that's not the law. It really depends on the case. Okay, since we're talking about Torah scrolls, the Gemara tells us that you can have one Torah scroll, one scroll of all 24 books of the Tanakh, meaning not only Torah, but also the books of the prophets and of the writings of Ketuvim. Or no, you need to have separate a scroll of Torah, a scroll of Nevi'im, and a scroll of Ketuvim. Or no, for Nevi'im and Ketuvim, they need to have their own separate scroll. Okay, now between each Chumash, right, when you have a Torah scroll, between Breshit and Shmot, you need to leave 4 empty lines. So too between books of Navi, if you're going to read them, so then you can if you're going to write them on one scroll, you have to leave spaces in between. But you can also have 3 lines between books of Trei Asar, right? Trei Asar are what we would call the minor prophets. It's a book of 12 small, short prophets, right? Yonah is part of that. So those you can leave a little bit less room when you're writing it. If you finish the book on the bottom of the scroll, you can start right on the bottom of a column. So then you can start at the top of the next column. You don't have to skip any space. You can connect all of Tanakh together in one scroll, as we weren't sure beforehand. And we said you have to leave blank parchment at the beginning in order to wrap around the pole, and at the end in order to wrap around the entire scroll. Okay, Daf 14. If the end of the Navi is at the bottom of the page, you start at the top of the next column, because if he wants to cut those 2 books in half, you can, and therefore, right, you cut it right down the middle. The Gemara tells us that a Torah, here you can see in the picture, a Torah has 2 poles, 2 Atzei Chayim, it's called an Eitz Chayim. It has two poles, the beginning of the end, and therefore you have to leave the same amount of blank parchment at the end. A Navi or Ktuvim are like this, what you would say like a Megillah, right? It's a scroll, but it only has one pole, and the other side is blank, right? Is free to be rolled around the entire scroll. The Gemara tells us that you cannot okay. The Gemara tells us you can't make the length of the Torah scroll more than the circumference of the Torah scroll. And the Gemara tells us that this is very, very difficult, and talks about different people writing many different Sifrei Torah, right, many Torah scrolls, and it was very hard for them to figure out the height of the Torah scroll so that it would equal the circumference of the Torah scroll. Since we're talking about writing a Torah, the Gemara talks about Moshe's, the ark, right? The Aron HaBrit. Here's a picture of it on the top when it was closed. But inside, right, it housed the two tablets, the luchot. So the Gemara is going to do a lot of like math, a lot of computation. So the Gemara tells us that the Aron, the ark, is 15 by 9 tfachim. The luchot, the tablets, were 6 by 6. Therefore, they took up 12 tfachim, plus the thickness of the wall. That leaves 2 tfachim on the side. And this is where Moshe put his own Sefer Torah, right? Moshe wrote his own Sefer Torah, and it was placed inside the ark. Another option is that maybe it was, there's another, okay, we'll get to that in a second. There's another computation, maybe it was 12.5 by 7.5, and then there's very little space left. And therefore, what would they do? They actually rolled up the Torah. You can see here, like on the bottom of the page, they would roll up the Torah and then leave a little bit on the top, and that's how it was able to fit in that space of extra space. So here we talk about the fact that there didn't seem to be any space inside the ark, if that was the case. And therefore, the Gemara talks about the idea that maybe the Torah scroll was actually on the outside. There was a shelf on the outside of the ark, and that is where Moshe's Torah scroll sat. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, and that is where the Torah scroll sat, again, either on the inside or on the outside. Okay, since we're talking about a Torah scroll and we were talking about Tanakh, now the Gemara goes into a lengthy discussion, though I think fascinating, it's not though, and I think it's fascinating, about the different books in our Tanakh. So the order of the prophets, there's a machluket, which comes first, and the Gemara tells us this is the order, even though, by the way, it's not our order today. But the books of the prophets are Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Melachim, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, Yishayahu, Shnei Masar, right? Trei Asar. That is the order. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, Hosea, which is part of Trei Asar, was really early. It should be before Yirmiyahu. But because it was short, they put it as part of Trei Asar, and therefore it is at the end with all of the short prophets. Yishayahu really should have been first after Melachim, because chronologically it came first. So the Gemara says, no, let's look at topic. Right? Yishayahu is all about nechama, about comfort, and therefore, but Melachim ends, right? The book of Kings ends with the destruction of the temple. Since we're talking about the destruction, we should put Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu also talks about destruction, but there is a little bit of comfort at the end, and therefore afterwards, right? And then, then Yecheskel is destruction and comfort, and then Yeshayahu, which is all comfort. Let's go to the order of Ketuvim. Also, this is not necessarily the way I liked consolation. That's a good word. Thank you, Zohar. Now there's the chronological order of Ketuvim, of writings, even though this is not the way our Tanakh is arranged, but the order chronologically, it's Ruth, Tehillim, Iyov, which is Job, Mishlei, Kohelet, Shir HaShirim, and Eicha, Daniel, Esther, Ezra, Divrei Hayamim, right? And that really gives us like a sweeping idea of Jewish history. And since we mentioned Iyov, right? There's a machloket when Iyov lived. Maybe he lived during the, again, we're not sure what time he lived. We'll get there in a second. But maybe he lived during the time of Abraham. So maybe he should be first, but we don't want to start with punishment. And therefore we do root, even though in the beginning there is punishment, but it ends very positively. Now we're talking about who wrote what book. So it says Moshe wrote the Torah and Iyov, which is Job. Yehoshua wrote his own book and the last 8 verses of the Torah. Samuel wrote his book, plus Shoftim, Judges, and Ruth. David wrote Tehillim, Psalms, with 10 elders, and the Gemara tells us who these elders are: Moshe, Avram, Melchizedek, Adam, Korach, other prophets. Daf 15. By the way, I'm doing through Wednesday's daf, so you guys are going to be ahead of everybody else. Yirmiyahu wrote his own book, plus the book of Kings and Eicha, Lamentations. Chizkiyahu wrote Kohelet, Shir HaShirim, Mishlei, and Yeshayahu, which is, again, not so clear. Anshe Knesset Agdola, the sages of the Great Assembly, wrote Esther, Daniel, Trei Asar, and Yechezkel. Ezra wrote his book, and Divrei Hayamim up to him, and Nehemiah finished it off. Okay, now we have a very famous machloket of who wrote the last 8 verses of the Torah. Yes, Zohar is asking, what about Kohelet? Isn't that Shlomo? Yes, there is a very famous opinion that Shlomo wrote Kohelet, Shir HaShirim, and Mishlei. This Gemara seems to be in contradiction to that. But we do have another Gemara that says that it was Shlomo. I think it's in Megillah. So there are different opinions. Okay, who wrote the last 8 lines of the Torah? Again, the last 8 lines speak about Moshe's death. One option is Yoshua wrote it, because obviously Moshe died, or Moshe wrote it, but he, right, it says he was actually, he wrote it in tears, right? And as Moshe discovers what is actually going to happen to him. It says Pinchas finished the end of Yoshua, right after Yoshua dies. Gad and Natan finish Shmuel after he dies. We have the idea of Eitan HaEzrachi. This is Avraham, and speaking about different people who wrote different psalms. And since we mentioned Iyov, now till the end we're going to discuss Iyov. So one option is that Moshe wrote it, he lived during his time, or maybe he lived during the time of the spies. Maybe Iyov, right? It says Job lived a very long life. Or another option is he never existed at all. He's just a mashal, right? A parable. Or maybe he came back with the people the return of Zion, and he lived in Tiberia, or maybe he lived during the time when the Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt. Some say he lived 210 years. Another question is, was he Jewish or not, right? Some say that he was a prophet and that he was not Jewish. Others say that he was Jewish, but he prophesied for non-Jews. Some say, again, as we continue, right, maybe he lived during the time of the judges, Sefer Shoftim, maybe during the time of Achashverosh, which is Purim, maybe the time of Sheba, maybe the time of the Kasdim, maybe the time of Yaakov. Some say that he actually marries Dinah, who is Yaakov's daughter, but many say that he was Jewish. They say that in the generation of Eov, everybody is immoral, and that's why things are really bad. Also, again, maybe it's the time of the Shoftim, and that's why things are really bad. From here, the Gemara talks about different verses in Eov, and interprets what the verses were saying. So we'll begin that, and then we'll continue next week. The verses of Eov says that Hashem asks the Satan, right, Satan, where have you been? And he says, I was searching the world to find someone as faithful to God as Abraham, and I haven't found anybody like Abraham. And God says, well, what about Eov? Eov is the best. He's even greater than Abraham. And right, Eov is very giving of his money. The Satan says, well, listen, you gave him everything, so obviously he loves you so much. So Hashem says, you know what, Satan, do your best, try your hardest. You can do whatever you want to Eov, just you're not allowed to harm his person. Here the Gemara describes that things are so good for Eov that when he plows, immediately things start to grow. And it's as if it's like the world to come. We're going to stop here on a beautifully positive note before things become very challenging. But we will discuss that next week. So wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. Next week we will also be meeting on Monday night. Is that true? Sorry, 1 second. Let me just check to confirm. Next week, yes, next week we are meeting Monday night. Again, I will send an email. Hopefully the email will work. There's a problem with the Web Yeshiva system, but hopefully by next week it will work. And I will see everyone next week. So wishing everyone I guess it's Shavua Tov since it's Monday. Shavua Tov, everyone.